Chapter 19. The frosty mist rose slowly off the ground and floated around them, seeking the sun. It would burn off soon enough, but for now, Beryl and her father were trapped in a fog where the only sound was the clopping of their horses' hooves. Beryl felt the pressure shift in the air and spotted a stork with its enormous wingspan gliding above her head. Its flight was soundless. She remembered another ride she had once taken with her father. "If we keep up this pace, we'll be at the Elkingtons for lunch." Her father's voice broke the silence like an egg cracking. "It's a good thing that Emma and little A decided not to come. They'd need the wagon, and it would take twice as long," Beryl added, watching her father's profile. Was it true that Emma wasn't welcome? Staring straight ahead into the gloom, her father said, "Emma preferred to stay home and get some house cleaning done." "How much more cleaning can she do?" Beryl asked. "Never mind. Let's just ride." Her father had returned from his trip with the settlers a week earlier, but he had still not said a word about the incident with Mayru. Waiting for him to bring up the subject, Beryl felt as though her saddle was made of tacks. To distract herself, she stole sidelong glances to see how the captain sat on the Baron. Beryl deliberately lengthened her reins like his, resettled herself in the saddle several times to imitate him, and practically sprained her ankles trying to keep her heels pointed down as his were. Luckily, Wee McGregor was tolerant of all her wiggling. "Beryl, stop fidgeting. You'll drive that pony to distraction," her father snapped. "Sorry, Daddy." But Beryl couldn't help smiling. It was such a relief to have him scold her, as he usually did. As the sun rose in the sky, Green Hills Farm was lost behind them in the summer haze, but there were still hours of riding before they would arrive at the Elkington farm. Her father reined in his gelding to ride close to her. He sighed. "You look like a wrinkled sack. Would it have been so difficult to dress up today?" "What else should I wear? It's a long ride." Beryl's khaki trousers and white linen shirt were identical to her father's, except his had creases in all the right places. He had never abandoned the discipline he learned in the army. She tried to smooth out the wrinkles, but soon gave up. The tranquil landscape was suddenly shaken by a lion's roar. The deep sound was several miles off, but the horses skittered nervously. Wee McGregor grabbed the bit between his teeth and tried to bolt, but Beryl was prepared for his tricks. "That's Paddy," she said cheerfully, holding tight to the reins and pulling Wee McGregor around in a circle to keep him from running off. "Jim Elkington is a fool," said the captain, smacking the top of the Baron's head with a crop to bring him under control. "Whoever heard of naming a lion?" "Paddy is Margaret's pet," Beryl said. "He's perfectly tame. It's not as though he's a wild lion." Margaret was Jim Elkington's daughter. When Paddy's mother had been shot, Margaret had saved the cub by hand-feeding it from a bottle with milk and eggs. The lion had reached full growth by eating meat that Elkington's workers caught for him. Beryl was fascinated by Paddy. She had often watched the lion wandering Mr. Jim's farm like an emperor surveying his domain. He always walked alone. He had never seen the inside of a cage, but he reeked of humans, and he would never be accepted by wild lions. Her father snorted. "A tame lion is an unnatural lion, and untrustworthy. Beryl, don't you ever forget that." "I'm not afraid," she assured him. The captain pulled his horse in front of Beryl's and grabbed Wee McGregor's bridle. "Young lady, I know you're brave enough. Going on that fool lion hunt proved that. But even warriors show some caution. Watch yourself around that lion." She nodded without saying anything. He stared at her with his stern grey eyes, unsatisfied with what he saw. Beryl Clutterbuck, I'm not certain the LeMay woman was totally at fault. I think you asked for the trouble she gave you. But, Daddy, she was awful. And ugly to boot, but don't tell Emma I said so. They grinned at each other. And I know you were just defending yourself from that boy. What was his name? Meru. But you seem to find danger wherever you go. Today, let's not go looking for it, all right? Beryl bobbed her head more enthusiastically this time. The captain kicked his horse into a canter. The sun beating down on their backs, they galloped toward the roaring of the tame lion. They arrived at the farm in the middle of the afternoon. The captain's new Indian servant, Bishon Singh, had arrived the night before and was waiting for them. He held their bridles as they dismounted. Mr. Jim came down from the house to greet them. He was a bald man and very round, but his roundness was muscle, not fat. His belt was a strip of rhino leather he had cured himself. His kiboko, cut from the same rhino hide, was coiled and hung on a loop at his hip. Mr. Jim was no gentleman farmer, ordering the natives to do the dangerous work. He did it himself. His daughter, Margaret, trailed behind her bulky father, almost hopping with excitement at seeing Beryl. She waited for the adults to walk away and then rushed up to Beryl, who was sitting on the edge of a trough, pulling off her sweaty riding boots, followed by her dirty socks. "Hello, Beryl." Margaret looked down at Beryl's bare feet with a frown crinkling her pale forehead. "Margaret," Beryl replied. "I thought you'd never get here," she said. "You haven't been here in almost a year." Beryl said indifferently, "You could always visit us." Margaret shook her head. "Oh, no, my mother would never permit it." "Why not?" Beryl asked. "She says your household is irregular." Margaret sounded puzzled, as though she were parroting an adult conversation she hadn't understood. "What does that mean?" Beryl asked warily. "I don't know." Margaret twirled around, making her skirt flare. "Do you like my new dress?" She wore a frilly white tea dress and a straw hat with another white ribbon around the crown, carefully protecting her skin from the sun. Mrs. Elkington often said that Margaret and Beryl could be twins, since they were both tall with long blonde hair. But Beryl's hair was a wild mess, while Margaret's was neatly plaited with white ribbons. "It's only last year's fashion," Margaret said proudly. "It's very nice," Beryl lied. "I wish we could get the latest styles more quickly. It takes forever." "Why do you care about what's fashionable 2 continents away?" "You don't know anything, Beryl." "I know that fashion is stupid." Beryl started toward the house. "Didn't you bring shoes?" Margaret asked. "Why?" Beryl asked. She looked down at her stained and calloused feet. "I always walk barefoot. You couldn't stalk a warthog with your squeaky boots." "Why would I—" "Never mind, Beryl. I don't know why I bothered. Come have tea. I baked shortbread and ginger snaps." After the long ride, the thought of cakes and biscuits set Beryl's mouth to watering, so she willingly followed Margaret behind their house. Beryl always laughed when she saw their garden. Mrs. Elkington had tried to create an English garden with white-painted lawn furniture and a bone china tea set. The illusion worked until you looked beyond the patch of cultivated grass that needed hand-watering from the well twice a day in the dry season. Africa didn't go away just because you pretended it wasn't there. The men gathered in a circle around her father. The captain chuckled at one of Mr. Jim's jokes. Next to Mr. Jim's cannonball shape, the captain looked like a white Nandi warrior, straight as a spear. Beryl sidled over to listen. They were talking solemnly of politics in faraway England, the price of grain, and the prospects for the Nairobi St. Leger horse race. The few women present were fussing about a table covered in blindingly white linen. Beryl examined the treats they were arranging on platters, pretending not to notice how the adult women were looking her over and exchanging knowing glances. Margaret began pouring tea from a silver pot and offering 1 lump or 2 of sugar to the guests. Beryl hovered, waiting for her sweets so she could escape. Even though the party was outside, she found it hard to breathe. The conversation, the manners, even the bone china seemed to suck away her air. She practically grabbed a plate out of Margaret's hands and backed quickly away, mumbling her thanks. Reaching the veranda, she edged around the corner. Out of sight of the others, she shoved the pastries in her mouth. Licking her lips, she took a good look around. The Elkington farm was at the edge of the Kikuyu Reserve. The country looked different here. There was no forest, just plains. Beryl began to explore, her body carving its way through the hazy air like the sharp edge of her knife. As she ran through a stand of trees, her feet crunched the dead cicadas on the ground. What she found on the other side stopped her in her tracks. Paddy the lion was sprawled there without a care in the world. As lions go, he was quite small. But the last time she had faced a lion, Arup Minor and Tepli had been there, and they had nearly died. Paddy was only a few yards away, nothing compared to the distance he could leap if he chose. She stared at his black mane and his rusty red fur. She remembered stroking that fur when he was a cub. "Remember me, Paddy?" she whispered. "We used to be friends." He lifted his large head and stared at Beryl through his heavy-lidded yellow eyes. The only sound she heard was the thumping of his tail on the dry ground. Beryl fought to control the panic welling up in her stomach. Very casually, almost as if she were scratching an itch, she reached down to her calf and pulled her knife out of its sheath. Her father's description of a tame lion, untrustworthy, hung in the haze. Paddy shimmered in the waves of heat. She took careful, measured steps and started to walk past him. To show Paddy that she was not afraid, she began to sing a marching song that Arup Minor had taught her. She sang in Swahili, so Paddy would be sure to understand. Kali koma simba sisi, asekari yoti ni udari. Fierce like the lion are we, warriors all are brave. Perhaps she imagined it. But the tuft at the end of Paddy's weighty tail seemed to beat time with her song. Her voice cracking with the strain of sounding braver than she felt, she went past him, up the hill, out of his line of sight. Once on the other side of the hill, she bent over, breathing deeply to settle her stomach. She had been lucky, she thought, as she replaced her knife in its sheath. Looking out over the hot and dry horizon, she noticed that there was no wind to stir the grass. For all its teeming life, Africa was often silent, as it was that day. Beryl began to practice running on the balls of her feet, quietly, as Tepli had taught her. Suddenly, she heard a low growl behind her. She whirled around. Paddy raced up the hill toward her, making hardly any noise. He gathered his haunches and leapt. Beryl went down under his massive paws as easily as if she were a gazelle. His large fangs sank into the flesh of her right leg. Paddy lifted his head and slammed Beryl onto the earth. Beryl opened her mouth to scream, but her cry was ground into the dirt. Paddy's musky smell blocked everything else. His weight settled on her back. She could feel the claws of his hind paws behind her neck. An immense roar became her whole world. From very far away she could hear the voices of men. Bichon Singh was shrieking for help. Mr. Jim's shouts were punctuated with the whistling crack of his kiboko. Paddy's teeth slipped out of Beryl's calf as he turned his heavy head to look at the intruder. The pain in her legs stabbed like a knife. Her body shook with the rumbling of his angry growl. Suddenly his claws were pushing off Beryl's body as he abandoned his prey and faced the new enemy. Beryl dared to open her eyes in time to see Mr. Jim rush headlong at Paddy. But Paddy didn't back down. Beryl struggled to stand on her throbbing leg. Her head swam. Suddenly Bichon Singh's hands were on her, scooping her off the ground. He threw her over his shoulder and started running. As she bounced, she could see Mr. Jim and Paddy circling each other like duelists. Paddy roared his terrible roar. To Beryl's surprise, Mr. Jim lost his nerve. He dropped the whip and clambered up the nearest tree. Then Bichon Singh carried her away, and all was nothingness. "So what happened next?" Beryl asked Bichon Singh. She lay in a soft bed in a room with white organza curtains. Her wounds were bandaged, and her head was befuddled with liberal doses of whiskey administered to numb the pain. Bichon Singh dipped his head so low that Beryl feared his massive turban might tumble off. "Miss Beryl, I was happy with the duty of advising your father that you had been moderately eaten by the large lion. Your father returned very fast, but the large lion has not returned at all." The next day, Margaret came in to change Beryl's bandages. "Hello, Margaret," Beryl said cheerfully. "How's Paddy?" "They didn't find him until yesterday," she said, "but only after he killed a cow, a horse, and a bullock." Beryl burst out laughing. "I've always thought that meat you hunted yourself tasted better." "You don't understand, Beryl." Margaret looked up from Beryl's leg, where she was unwinding the bandages. Her eyes were red from weeping. "Papa says he has to stay in a cage now, forever." Beryl was silent, remembering how she felt when Miss LeMay locked her in her hut. Margaret went on. "And it's all your fault." "My fault?" Beryl asked, suddenly angry. "I was mauled." "You know better than to tempt Paddy like that, running past him like a rabbit in those bare feet. He was a good lion until you came." Beryl started to protest, but stopped. If she hadn't been so reckless, would Paddy have attacked? Margaret finished unwrapping Beryl's leg. She looked down at the assortment of punctures. "It's only a scratch," she sniffed. "It's not like you won't be able to walk." Beryl sat up and looked down at the ugly red wounds. "Are you insane? Paddy tried to eat me. And thanks to you, he'll die in a cage." And to Beryl's surprise, Margaret burst into tears and ran howling out of the room. A few days later, Beryl was well enough to ride home. She followed Paddy's plaintive roar to find the noble beast imprisoned in a too small cage behind the stables. When Paddy saw Beryl, he stopped roaring and stared at her with dulled eyes. Beryl's own eyes filled with tears as she saw that he no longer looked at her as prey. "I'm sorry, Paddy," she whispered. "I know you were just taking your chance to be a wild lion." "His only chance, as it turns out." The captain came up behind her. "Jim Elkington promises to keep him locked up for good." Beryl felt a pang in her chest. "Oh, Daddy! He couldn't help attacking me. It's in his nature." "Just as it is in yours to risk your neck. Well, no more. I'm clipping your wings." As though the cage door had clanged behind her, Beryl whirled around to face her father. "What do you mean?" "You're going away to school. I can't trust you to keep out of trouble if you stay up here." "Did Emma—" Beryl began angrily. "Beryl, you brought this on yourself." The steel in her father's voice silenced her. "You could easily have been killed last month, last week, 2 days ago. No argument. You go to Nairobi as soon as Emma can get you packed." They mounted their horses. Beryl thought furiously as they rode. They had covered several miles before she spoke again. "Daddy, I don't need to go to school." "Beryl, the subject is closed." "I want to stay up here." "No." The horses clip-clopped for half a mile or so before she tried again. "Daddy, I'm not my mother to be frightened away, or Emma to cower in the house. I want to be your partner on the farm." "You're too young," he said automatically. Then he did a double take. "How old are you now?" "I don't keep track," Beryl answered. This wasn't the time to remind him that she was only 12. Another birthday had come and gone without anyone at Green Hills Farm, including Beryl, taking notice. She went on, "But I'll tell you one thing. If I were a Nandi girl, I could be married now." "If you were a Nandi girl, I wouldn't have to worry about you getting into trouble." The captain went on, and his voice was suddenly bleak. "You could have been killed by that lion." "What if I gave up hunting?" Beryl offered. "Beryl, it's not enough. I have a reputation to worry about. It makes me look eccentric if you don't get an education." His tone was final. Beryl wondered if she could salvage anything. "How much education do I need?" she asked. "I don't want to go to university. I want to stay in Africa and help you run the farm." "You'll need more mathematics if you are to help me with the books." It was a tiny crack in his resolve. Beryl wasted no time driving in a wedge. "So 3 months of arithmetic and I'd be ready?" 2 years, he countered. 6 months should be plenty. I'll study hard." 1 year, and that's as low as I go. Emma will insist on that much. "Agreed. A year." "But if you don't last a year, I'll—" The captain trailed off, trying to think of the most awful punishment he could devise. Finally, his eyes lit up. "I'll send you to your mother in England." Swallowing hard, Beryl nodded. During the rest of the ride, Beryl had time to consider the bargain she had made. Her taunting of Paddy had cost her a year of schooling, but the lion would live out the rest of his life in a cage. They had both paid for her folly with their freedom. Location: off the coast of Nova Scotia. Date: 1:05 a.m. EST. 5th September 1936. My engine is shuddering. Then it coughs, spitting black exhaust toward the sea. I watch my hands working furiously, as if they aren't attached to my body. When the engine stops, the sudden silence stuns me. I can't feel fear. I can't feel anything. It has to be an airlock, a bubble of air in the tubes, blocking the fuel flow. I open and close all the petcocks, cutting my fingers on the sharp metal edges. The engine catches again and roars back to life. I climb. North America is close enough to see, but perhaps too far to fly to. The engine cuts out, and I glide down toward the cliffs of Newfoundland. On, off, stop, go. Each minute brings me closer to the airport at Cape Breton. Seesawing between life and death, I'm hypnotized by the altimeter. I'm over land, gliding over green pasture. The airport must be close. One more time, little messenger. Just start for me, one more time. Chapter 20. Your father is a coward, Emma said to Beryl as they boarded the train at Nakuru. Her stomach twisted in a bitter knot. Beryl didn't try to defend the captain. At the last minute, he had made a feeble excuse not to accompany her to school and had sent Emma in his place. While the other passengers chatted, playing cards, and sipped from flasks, Beryl and Emma had spoken perhaps 10 words during the long, bone-jarring trip. On her previous trips to Nairobi, Beryl had never thought of the train ride as uncomfortable. But then she had always been with her father, and she had had a return ticket. When the train pulled into Nairobi, Emma fixed her dark hair, now reddish with dust. After she washed her face, she looked happier than Beryl had ever seen her. I love the city, she said. They walked out of the station onto the street, followed by a porter hauling Beryl's trunk and Emma's suitcase. The sun had already set, but the streets were filled with carriages and people. There were even a few of those noisy new automobiles. Beryl put her hands over her ears. Stop that, Beryl. You look ridiculous, Emma snapped as the porter flagged a rickshaw for them. The Nairobi School for European Children, she ordered the driver. Yes, Mem-Sab. The rickshaw driver bundled them into the narrow seat. He sighed when he looked at Beryl's heavy trunk. The porter helped him lift it and secure it to the back of the cart. Then the driver grabbed hold of the handles and, with a heave, began pulling Beryl toward her new life. The school was at the top of a hill overlooking what had become downtown. If Beryl had not been so miserable, she might have exclaimed at how much bigger the city had grown. A few years ago, it had been burned to the ground to fight a plague. But the city had already rebuilt itself and gotten even bigger. It was fully dark by the time Emma and Beryl arrived at the school. Even high up on a hill, and after the sun had set, the muggy heat weighed on Beryl's skin. Stiff from the long journey, she unfolded her long legs and got out of the rickshaw. She let the driver help Emma out. Wait here, Emma said to the driver. I won't be long. Beryl stared at her new home. The school looked like the letter E, with the middle stroke removed. It sat on stilts, and Beryl could not see what was underneath. A door opened wide at the top of the wooden stairs in the centre of the building, and a slim figure appeared. She was holding a lantern, which spilled light down to Beryl and Emma. A high-pitched nasal voice called out, Hello, Clatterbucks. I was afraid that awful train had finally broken down in the wilderness. Come up, come up. You must be exhausted. Watch your step. These stairs are steep, but we find that the building stays cooler off the ground. It was the proprietress herself, Miss Seckham. Beryl and Emma blinked at her, their eyes adjusting to the light of the paraffin lantern. Miss Seckham was a slight woman with a pasty face. Her brown hair was gathered underneath a cotton kerchief. She ushered them into a tiny parlour that smelled of furniture polish. Sit down, she said, gesturing to an overstuffed sofa. When she sat down, Beryl discovered that the sofa wasn't as comfortable as it looked. Emma settled in next to her, placing her grey-gloved hand over Beryl's scratched brown hand. Beryl pulled her hand away. Emma sighed. Miss Seckham smiled, revealing a healthy amount of teeth. Beryl was reminded of a hyena's grin. She spoke only to Emma. My school accepts only children from the best British families. There are 7 other girls her age. We teach boys as well, but they are confined to their half of the school with their own dormitory, teacher, and classroom. She pushed toward them a tray that held glasses of lemonade. I'm sure Beryl will be happy here, Mrs. Clutterbuck. Before Emma could reply, Beryl croaked, She's not my father's wife. Don't call her Clutterbuck. Then she began coughing from the dust and her long silence. She took the glass in front of her and gulped it down. There was an embarrassed silence before Emma found her voice. I'm not Beryl's mother, Miss Seckham. I help her father with the housekeeping. Miss Seckham looked at Emma's white cotton travelling dress and fashionable hat. Oh, I see. She looked down her pointy nose. Well then, Mrs. Orchardson, corrected Emma. Beryl glared at her. This was the first she had heard of Emma's husband since Emma had arrived over a year ago. Miss Seckham coughed. Mrs. Orchardson, would you like to see the school? It's late for a tour, but I can... Emma said hurriedly. No, I've delivered Beryl. I must be going to the hotel. She hesitated, and then put her arms around Beryl in an awkward embrace. Beryl kept her arms straight at her sides. Emma whispered, Behave yourself, Beryl. Your father sends you his love. She said a quick farewell to Miss Seckham and was gone. Beryl couldn't help feeling abandoned as the echo of Emma's steps faded in the stairway. Before the door had slammed closed, the headmistress's smile had disappeared. Holding her lantern high, she led Beryl into a narrow hallway. Miss Seckham pointed to the left. That is the boys' wing. The girls are down here. The lantern threw strange shadows on the whitewashed walls. Miss Clutterbuck, there are a few rules I expect you to abide by during your time here. Miss Seckham pointed to a hand-lettered sign on the wall. You shall not blaspheme. You shall not tell falsehoods. You shall not disrespect the faculty. You shall not leave the premises without permission. You shall not resort to violence. Break these rules and you face severe disciplinary action, perhaps even expulsion. Beryl found comfort in the rules. Who knew it was so easy to be expelled? She thought longingly of Arup Minor, of following him into the forest, learning to imitate animal noises, practicing her wrestling moves. Arup Minor taught by example, not with lists of stupid rules. Your father wrote that you have lacked a certain discipline in the past, Beryl. That won't be tolerated here. Yes, ma'am, said Beryl in a low voice, flexing her hands that had once taken so much discipline from Miss LeMay. Don't mutter, dear, admonished Miss Seckham, and don't clench your fists. Yes, ma'am, Beryl muttered. This is the girls' dormitory. Miss Seckham opened the door to a long room with beds lined up in a row against the wall. Half a dozen or so girls, clad in long white nightgowns, were preparing for bed by the light of 2 candles. When the door opened, they fell silent. This is your bed, Miss Seckham said, pointing to a bed at the end. You can put your clothes in this chest. She opened it and clucked her tongue. Whose things are these? Each girl gets 1 chest. Who is using Beryl's? A girl with long black hair and a turned-up nose flipped back her bed covers and hopped out of bed. They're my things, Miss Seckham. Mary, how many times have I told you? But there isn't room for all my clothes, the girl protested. Remove them, said Miss Seckham. Beryl said, I haven't brought many clothes. She can have it if she wants it. Actually, Beryl had no idea what she had brought. Emma had supervised the packing. Beryl, that's very generous of you, but Mary knows the rules. Mary gave Beryl a baleful look, opened the chest, pulled out her dresses, and took them away to her own dresser. Mary's hair was something to see. It was divided into a dozen plaits, each twisted around a damp rag, like a crop of black snakes had sprouted on her head. Beryl remembered a story her father had told her of Medusa. She wondered whether Mary was as dangerous. Beryl, the other girls can show you the outhouse and explain the morning schedule. Handing Beryl a candle, Miss Seckham left the room, leaving her surrounded by more girls than she had ever been with in her life. Their eyes gleamed in the dim room like predators in the forest. She was outnumbered and out of her element. Deep in the privacy of her own mind, she chanted, I'm a Murani. I'm a Murani. The girl with too many clothes stepped forward. I'm Mary Russell. Who are you? Beryl Clutterbuck. Clutterbuck? I've never heard of you. A short girl with brown curly hair spoke up. Clutterbuck? Captain Clut? The racehorse trainer? He's my father, Beryl said, cheered that someone knew about things that mattered. My father wants to buy one of his horses. He says the captain raises the best. Does he want a mare or a gelding? Beryl asked eagerly. I know every horse, and Mary interrupted. Enough about horses. Raising horses is hardly a gentleman's profession. Beryl bristled. So what does your father do that is so gentlemanly? Mary tossed back her ragged snakes. Nothing, of course. He lives off his income. The other girls tittered. Furious that she had given Mary a chance to make fun of her, Beryl asked, What's he doing in Africa, then? Waiting on his remittance check? The other girls gasped. Remittance men were the black sheep of good families, whose relatives happily paid them an allowance to stay far away from England. After the initial shock, the girls began to laugh. The girl who had asked about horses laughed harder than the others. Mary, watch your step with this one. She formally held out her hand to Beryl and introduced herself. I'm Doris Waterman. Mary's angry cheeks had 2 high spots of colour, visible even in the candlelight. I really had better watch my step. Beryl's brought in manure on her shoes. Can't you smell it? Beryl clenched her fist so that her nails dug into her palms. Trying to seem unconcerned, she lifted a foot to her nose and sniffed. Effortlessly, she switched feet and sniffed again. She shrugged. The other girls stared, stunned that she could pull her foot so high, so effortlessly. Mary tried again. Are you sure you are in the right room? With those trousers and man's shirt, maybe you should be in the boys' dormitory. Beryl looked down at her khaki breeches and white linen shirt. She hadn't bothered to change after her last ride on Camiscan. Mary clearly meant to be rude, but Beryl couldn't see where the insult was. She glanced around at the strange girls. I'd rather wear comfortable clothes than a stupid dress, she muttered. Oh, you'll wear a dress. Miss Seckham will insist. You'll have to make lots of changes to fit in with us, but you will change, Mary promised. I guarantee it. The thought of stockings, stays, tight shoes, dresses and hats brought home Beryl's new situation. Tears welled up in her eyes. Dashing them away with the back of her hand, she opened her mouth to say something cutting to Mary, but no sound came out. Mary took advantage of her silence and announced, Lights out! She bent over and blew out Beryl's candle. On her signal, someone extinguished the second candle. Beryl was left alone in the dark. Without bothering to undress, she reached into her satchel and unerringly picked out the one bundle she cared about. Her lion's paw was wrapped in an old linen handkerchief. It had been smuggled in after Emma had approved the packing. Beryl threw her body onto the unfamiliar bed. Having never used a pillow before, she tossed it to the floor. The straw ticking of the mattress felt itchy through the cotton sheet. She lay in the dark, stroking the furry paw over and over. She longed for her usual lullaby of hyraxes, hyenas, and cicadas. But instead, the snores of 7 other girls, more threatening than any roar, kept her awake. Location: a peat bog, Baleen Cove, Nova Scotia, Canada. Date: 10:10 a.m. EST, 5th September 1936. The messenger won't start. It's dead as death. I hang over the earth on hope and a motionless propeller. The earth rushes to me. Can I lose enough speed to land safely? The wheels touch the green ground, and for a moment I think I've made it. But even the ground has betrayed me. It isn't solid. My wheels skim along the surface for perhaps 40 feet, but they find no purchase. They sink, and the nose crashes forward into the mud. I strike my head on the glass of the cockpit. I hear it shatter and feel a sharp pain on my forehead. Then nothing. After a time, I don't know how long, my eyes open. I blink against the brightness. There's wetness on my forehead. I touch it. I'm relieved beyond measure to see it is blood. Dead pilots don't bleed. I unstrap my harness and stumble out. Standing knee-deep in the bog, I can only stare at my watch. 21 hours and 25 minutes. Chapter 21. Students, take your seats. Miss Seckham clapped her hands briskly to get the girls' attention. In daylight, her wispy greyish-brown hair was pulled back so tight that it stretched her small face out to the hairline like an elastic band. With a sigh, Beryl turned her gaze from the window and back into the large classroom. The wide planks of the floor were fastened together by iron brackets recessed into the wood, making the floor resemble a railroad track. Cumbersome wooden desks were laid out in precise rows, and white porcelain inkwells perched on the tops of the desks like warts. Wincing from her new black patent leather boots, Beryl moved to her desk. She rubbed her nose, and the smell of flowery soap Miss Seckham had insisted she use made her sneeze. "Get out your books." Beryl lifted the heavy lid and pulled out her pen and books. She let the lid slam down with a bang. "Miss Clutterbuck, is that noise necessary?" asked Miss Seckham. "No, ma'am," muttered Beryl. The other girls tittered. They did that a lot. Beryl thought they sounded like colobus monkeys. If she closed her eyes, she almost felt she was at home. Miss Seckham cleared her throat. "Before we begin, I have a special announcement." The class stirred expectantly. "As you know, the class will be performing Alice in Wonderland for the holiday play. I think it will be a lovely welcome to our new student Beryl if she plays Alice." There were muffled gasps from the other girls. Mary stood up in indignation, shoving her desk across the floor with a loud squeak. "Miss Seckham, I was to play Alice." "I know, dear." Miss Seckham smiled her hyena smile. "But it's someone else's turn to play the lead." Doris piped up. Beryl looks the part more than you do, Mary. There was a chorus of agreement from the others. Beryl, who had never heard of Alice in Wonderland, was too bewildered to say anything. Mary's face was flushed, and there were tears in her eyes. But, Miss Seckham, Mary wailed. Take out your books, said Miss Seckham, ending the debate. First, the class read a passage in their primers about two sisters named Polly and Molly, and a tea party at a parsonage. Then Miss Seckham lifted her bell, a signal that the class was moving on to something else. Beryl was used to telling time by the position of the sun. Even her father's preoccupation with his pocket watch was less irritating than the tinkling of Miss Seckham's bell. Girls, for composition, I want you to write an essay about a moment that changed your life. I'll give you an hour for your first draft. Even though it was her first essay, Beryl didn't pause to consider her subject. She knew exactly what to say. With a decisive nod, she dipped the nib of her pen into the inkwell and began to write busily, filling up page after page. Miss Seckham rang her little bell. Excellent concentration, girls. Who would like to read her essay first? Beryl was not surprised to see Mary's hand shoot up. With a resigned nod, Miss Seckham told her to begin. Mary stood up, her starched cotton dress falling perfectly straight without a single wrinkle. Her hair was neatly gathered with a bow, so her black curls cascaded down her back. In a high, artificial voice, she recited,